Oh, okay. Recording now.
All right, thanks, Tao, and thanks everybody for joining us for session 7 of the book club. Hope everyone is enjoying the reading. As a reminder, we're on a recorded line. We're a mix of kind of Morningstar thought leaders and some outside industry gurus. Again, I'd love for this to be as conversational as possible. So if you have any questions or comments, please chime in. That would be great. If you're having technical difficulties, put it in the chat and or email Spencer or Tao. And then my hope and belief is that again, I should never say this, we might finish a smidgen early today. We're just covering one chapter, although depending on how much conversation we get going, we could go long. And then next week it'll be a final session. And that's kind of an interesting chapter where we take Isabella and we kind of move her through time, and we try to put the complete model together. So if you've been missing sessions, I'm going to put in a plug that next week will hopefully be our best and final session. In terms of where are we in the book, so we're now relatively deep into part 3 of the book, where we're discussing our grandchild model, and specifically today we'll be talking about chapter 11, where, if you'll recall from chapter 10, we talked about building personalized portfolios in a single account setting, kind of that utopian world in which there are no taxes and transaction costs. So it's kind of a typical institutional setting. We talked about the popularity asset pricing model and how it can be used or infers kind of an additional term into a Markowitz mean variance optimization problem, and can be used to put somebody's non-pecuniary preferences kind of on the same playing field as risk and return, and enables one to make trade-offs, hopefully in an optimal way, and end up with a personalized portfolio. And then you can see next week we'll be moving on to chapter 12. Here's a couple of learning outcomes associated with this chapter. And point 3 here, kind of all the benefits that we will eventually see of being able to simultaneously optimize across an investor's multiple accounts. As we do, we typically try to provide the context of the chapter within the broader book. And then to do that kind of graphically here, again, our life cycle model creates the answers to the big picture financial planning questions. The outputs of the life cycle model primarily being human capital estimates and an estimate of somebody's non-discretionary consumption liability, feed into our child model, the middle model, which is the new net worth optimization approach that we've put forth. The output from that child model, that net worth optimization, is different target asset allocations for somebody's qualified and unqualified money, and those targets, strategic asset allocations for those asset location aware targets, essentially become the inputs in the final step, this grandchild model, which we'll be expanding to include multiple accounts today. Again, so this graphically, kind of what are we talking about? So on the left, you have a single account with no transaction costs, no taxes. I think this is kind of the utopian world that most of our textbooks are usually addressing. And again, in this section of the book, and this chapter specifically, we expand that portfolio construction problem to having multiple different accounts or different account types with different tax treatment. So a tax-exempt account, or multiple tax-exempt accounts, tax-deferred accounts, and taxable accounts. And how do you simultaneously look across an individual's different accounts with the different account types and arrive at the optimal answer while considering any non-pecuniary preferences that they may or may not have. This is not exactly in the book, but I thought this would be a reasonable way to kind of set it up. And I guess I'd like to encourage all of you to think about these questions kind of as we move forward. If you were a wealth manager, a financial advisor, a financial planner, when should you move a client's, say, 401k assets into an IRA? When should you do a rollover? Should that rollover always be a full rollover if you're doing it, or should it, potentially be a partial rollover? Are there any circumstances in which an advisor should contemplate rollover? And in case you're not familiar with a reverse rollover, that would be where I'm taking money, say, out of a previous, say, 401k plan or an existing tax-deferred IRA, as an example. And then if my employer allows it, I could actually move money from my IRA into my current, say, 401k plan. And the reason I might want to do that is, the costs. Maybe I work for a mega company, a mega 401k plan that has fantastic pricing capabilities, and there's lower costs potentially in my 401k plan. And then question 4 here, how to fund expenses, the quality of investments, the availability of different investment options. How does all of that influence sort of this rollover decision? How do you think about where different investments should be located? If there are, assuming there's passive and active investment options in the different accounts on the different platforms, what should you be using and kind of where? Should money be consolidated like in a single account of the same tax type? Why or why not? Would that be optimal for a given investor beyond maybe just the ease of receiving a single statement? Maybe the client has invested in what I'll call a bad fund. I'm not quite sure what a bad fund would be, but maybe something with very high expenses and a very low or negative kind of expected alpha. But if that fund were to have a significant capital gain and be held in a taxable account, how do you make that trade-off between continuing to use that bad fund, continue to let that client's money be invested in the bad fund, or when should you sell it? How do you make that decision? A tough one to make. When should a portfolio be rebalanced? Is it just time based off of the degree to which the effective asset allocation of the portfolio is perhaps drifted away from the target asset allocation? In many cases, typically in a 401k plan, there might not be any trading costs, but in a number of accounts, there might be trading costs. Those could be fixed costs or variable costs. And how does that influence your decision to rebalance? Now, of course, again, what if there are trading costs in some accounts and not in others? How does that influence how you rebalance to try to hit the overall target and or sub-targets that might be account type specific? Now, if you were if you're say onboarding a new client, especially if they have taxable assets that may be have values that are well above their cost basis, how do you move them towards an appropriate target asset allocation and then contemplate what should be sold or bought? My belief is that this is an area where I think advisors often take it like just a time-based approach in which they want to sell off the client's existing taxable portfolio and move them towards an existing model portfolio that the advisor has created. And in many instances, that could be suboptimal. And again, there's complicated questions, and one should strive to answer them in an optimal way. Again, in the previous chapter, we were talking about personalization and how do you contemplate somebody's non-pecuniary preferences, whether those are values-based or faith-based or just preferences that the investor might have. How does the individual's tax bracket now and in the future perhaps even influence that decision? When a client needs to raise money to make a purchase, what should be sold? And does the selling of that item or items, does that mean that other things need to be bought in order to continue to track the target asset allocation in question? And then, kind of conversely, when a client receives new money, does that mean that, how do you put that money to work? And does that sometimes mean maybe some things should be sold and other things should be, purchased as one maybe moves towards better share classes, less expensive share classes that become available? And so my belief is that, advisors and wealth managers frequently face these types of questions and probably many more, and they frequently use heuristics and tackle them kind of on a one-by-one basis, when arguably all of these relate to the integrated kind of financial well-being of the person in question, and that in order to make any of these decisions, you really need to contemplate them all simultaneously. And of course, in this chapter 11, we put forth a framework for answering these questions simultaneously and arriving at an optimal answer to all of these questions. Going back just a bit, when we were discussing chapter 8, I think Paul put forth the child model, our joint asset allocation problem of net worth optimization. Ideally, one would be using that type of net worth optimization framework to come up with the targets that one has. A challenge in, say, the taxable world is that the return generation process simply works different in that utopian tax-free world of the institutional investor, and in the real world of individual investors, often in which they have money in taxable accounts. All of those returns don't belong to the investor, and the government is going to take some in the form of taxes. Paul, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about, I think it was in chapter 8, you talked about what adjustments in order to simultaneously optimize across qualified and unqualified asset classes, and what adjustments maybe need to be contemplated at the asset class level, and then we need to carry some of those adjustments through to funds when we're trying to optimize funds as we are here.
Yeah, so basically it's the same approach applied to funds that we previously applied to asset classes, with one possible difference. So with asset classes, which are just kind of abstractions, you may not have a good measure of a cost basis for calculating capital gains taxes. So we use a model to estimate the cost basis on each asset class. But when you're dealing with funds, with funds, there's an exact record of when you bought each fund and for how much. So I think at the fund level, you may have be able to further customize it by taking into account the actual capital, the actual cost basis, which which leads to the realized the estimate of realized capital gains in calculating an effective tax rate.
So Jeff Sostrin, I think you're on the call. I know you, again, not necessarily represented on the screen here, but kind of in the spirit of the screen. Frequently we estimate, the forward-looking expected alpha on funds, and a lot of that is done, in that kind of utopian world of no taxes and or a tax deferred setting. But then we need to eventually think about how do you estimate alphas on an after-tax basis. And I know you've been doing some work on that. I don't know if you care to comment a little bit about kind of additional work that you've been doing since the book has been published on this topic.
Yeah, so just the general way we think about it is that, in a tax unaware world, there's really one source of alpha, which is that, a fund manager can attempt to, pick better investments than, the overall market in terms of performance. In a tax-aware setting, there's actually two sources of alpha. So the first is the same as the one I just mentioned, but then the second one is to the extent that the manager can be, more tax efficient than whatever benchmark he or she is using, they're also providing alpha. And in a lot of cases, if they're, relatively tax inefficient, they're actually, they might have negative alpha in that sense. And so when we come up with our, what we call after-tax alphas, which are really just adjusted, we start with the pre-tax alpha and then adjust them to make them after-tax. We want to sort of take into account both of those items I mentioned. So in general, to go from the pre-tax alpha to the post-tax alpha, we'll multiply by, we'll consider the tax drag from owning the fund in a taxable account, and we'll use that to adjust the pre-tax alpha to post-tax, and that sort of accounts for, that first source of alpha. So if in a tax unaware setting, a manager is able to, pick funds that outperform, well, because of taxes, that advantage to doing that will be just a little bit less. Or perhaps they're really bad at picking funds, and so their alpha from that source will be negative, but because of taxes and it actually waters down the negative alpha aspect of it, so it's not as negative of an impact. But then to also consider the idea that they might be more or less tax efficient compared to their benchmark, we also need to consider the systematic component of the return, which is actually often one of the bigger components of return. If you have a fund that returns, I don't know, 10%, maybe 9.5% is just from the systematic portion of the return. It has an exposure to whichever asset classes that will have their expected returns. And then there's just that little additional part that is from the alpha. So the idea is that if a manager is relatively tax efficient, he or she will get to keep more of that systematic return. Whereas if they're relatively tax inefficient, they'll lose more of that systematic return. And so we have to be sure to account for all of that when we're modeling those after-tax alphas in our objective function.
Thanks, Jeff. And Paul. Moving on, I guess. So, back in chapter 10, we applied this equation, albeit in a single account environment. And this is, our alpha tracking error objective function, again, where we've expanded it to include the non-pecuniary term that is attempting to capture the degree to which a person derives utility or benefit from having a portfolio that tilts towards things that they like or love and away from things that they dislike or hate. And a challenge here that we face is how do we take this alpha tracking error optimization objective function and expand it to be able to simultaneously look across the different accounts that a person has, whether that's 2 accounts or 20. And it may not be so easy to see here. First of all, I have these little, equation 11.13, we now have all these little hats where the equation is essentially the same. And what these hats are trying to indicate that in each case, we've expanded either the vector or the matrix, as it might be, in question to account for the idea that we have multiple different accounts. And in chapter 11, we go into some detail as to how do we estimate those. And briefly here, without getting into too much of the weeds, I might joke this is about as complicated as things are ever going to look. What's happened is we have essentially expanded our estimates of alpha so that we have alpha estimates for every manager in each account type. In, again, the tax exempt and tax deferred setting, these are kind of our pre-tax or before tax utopian alphas, and then to the degree that if what it's holding a manager, that's on an after-tax setting. Here this HM is the change variable that the optimizer is changing in search of optimizing the objective function. Our vector of change variables here has just become much larger, and kind of in a similar spirit, each matrix and or vector, matrix, and matrix has essentially been expanded to account for the idea that we want to simultaneously optimize across all of the investor's different accounts, and do that in an appropriate manner. Related to that expanded change vector variable, so every available investment in each account and account type is essentially represented in that vector. And to the degree that somebody might have multiple tax lots, for all existing tax lots that they already have, that's included in that change variable as something that could be as a decision variable, essentially, where the optimizer might choose to completely sell off or partially sell off an existing tax lot. And later, I'm going to provide an example. We'll get to see a little bit how that actually works. Thus far, I have not really talked about transaction costs or taxes, but we have expanded, as explained in Chapter 11, our objective function to dynamically update the amount of realized transaction costs that would be associated with a buy or a sell of any of the items that across the different accounts. And we also want to capture any sort of realized taxes that are associated with perhaps selling an existing investment who's currently trading above its cost basis. And again, big picture, I would say that kind of upfront, we're capturing what I sometimes just think of as broadly the good. So what is good is alpha for the investor, having a portfolio that avoids what they dislike and tilts towards things that they like. And then everything after the minus sign here is all the things that a typical investor would dislike. They dislike active risk or tracking error, regardless of its kind of flavors. They dislike transaction costs, and they dislike having to pay taxes. And so in Chapter 11, we set up an example. And unfortunately, we weren't able to carry this example over to Isabella, our mythical investor. If we had had more time, we probably would have been able to carry Isabella's example throughout the entire book. But Paul and I, were in the creation of the book, grew upon a number of previously written articles, and unfortunately, this is one that we weren't able to sync up as much as I'd like. But so we now have an investor, not Isabella, but some other investor, and that person happens to have 4 different accounts: a tax-exempt account, a tax-deferred account that's their 401k, a tax-deferred IRA, and a taxable account. Something that we immediately kind of want to point out is that the nominal amount in the 2 tax-deferred accounts, we're giving them a haircut of some sort. And the reason that we're doing this is that when one is investing in a tax-deferred account, you're arguably in cahoots with at least one silent partner, perhaps 2 silent partners. The first silent partner is the federal government, which is going to take, eventually when you withdraw that money from that tax-deferred account, you're going to pay taxes on it, albeit you'll be paying taxes based off of kind of what tax bracket might you be in and what applicable tax rate do you have at the time of withdrawal, which for many people, they may be withdrawing money once they're retired, and so that rate might be lower. And so the applicable rate is, of course, what will the rate be when they're actually withdrawing from their tax-deferred accounts. In this example, you can see that we've assumed that the amount that they'll have to pay at the time of withdrawal is 20%. And so what's happening is right off the board, to kind of put each of these dollars on an equal footing, we're giving a haircut to the 2 tax-deferred accounts, so that they're really just focused on after-tax wealth of the individual, which in this case happens to sum to $500,000. And again, if anyone has questions along the way, I recognize this can get quite confusing, or perhaps I'll do a poor job of explaining, so please chime in. Another item, again, is that this optimization machinery, or the ability to look across multiple accounts, enables one to determine if somebody has multiple accounts of the same account type, should those be consolidated in some way, and or we typically think of this as the rollover decision. Should the person be contemplating rolling money out of their 401k into the IRA? If it's allowable, should it actually be a reverse rollover? And so in this kind of world of scrutiny, where the rollover decision is highly scrutinized, I'd say, we've come up with what I'd say is a new method that is very objective and repeatable, of just simply by looking at the quality of the investments in the different account types. Does a full or partial or reverse rollover make sense for a given individual? And so this is another form, or a new form, of a rollover optimization solution. I won't talk too much about this graph before I just kind of move on with the example, but we've come up with different targets: a tax-exempt target, a tax-deferred target, and a taxable target for this individual's wealth. Again, ideally, these vectors, these asset location based targets, would come out of the joint net worth optimization that Paul described in previous sessions. This could come from another source, could be independently derived, but nevertheless, in this example, we assume these targets are coming out of something like the net worth optimization, and then feeding into this grandchild multi-account optimization framework. And then we're going to eventually perform our optimization. To demonstrate how that works, I'm going to try to work you through Exhibit 11.2, which is displayed over 4 different slides. So kind of off in column 1 right now, and we're focused at this moment just on account 1. You get to see the very slimmed down set of investments, as well as what the person might already hold at this moment in time in their account 1, their tax-exempt account. Here you get to see that we have the applicable pre-tax alphas that would apply within a tax-exempt setting. I've listed just NAs in column 3 because an after-tax alpha doesn't really apply in this setting. When we get to the taxable account, row 2 or column 2 will become NAs, and column 3 will be populated with the corresponding appropriate after-tax alpha. Another important input would be, of course, the investment-specific tracking error associated with each of the investments. And what you can see here is that, by and large, these are small amounts of investment-specific tracking error, except for the case where one could choose to own employer stock, but it does come with a much higher amount of investment-specific risk, which should be very intuitive that individual stocks have a much larger amount of idiosyncratic risk. Here in columns 5, 6, and 7, you get to see what the person currently holds in terms of dollars. The cost basis and days held here are not applicable. And in this case, in their tax-exempt account, there happened to be, by assumption, we've assumed it's $20 for each trade. But I'll point out, that by knowing all of this information, we're able to move just beyond kind of what I think of as a smart reoptimizer or smart rebalancer to a smart reoptimization, which is going to look across all of the different trade-offs and in light of the trading costs and taxes, decide, is it in fact in the investor's best interest for them to go ahead and trade? So something that's noteworthy here, in account 2, the tax deferred 401k, the person does have $75,000 invested in employer stock, and then we'll get to determine whether that's a good investment or a bad investment. I believe there's no trading costs, which make the 401k a desirable place to the degree that it has desirable investments with which to transact. Account 3 is a tax deferred IRA. I think more notable than just what's highlighted on the screen is the idea that because we have account 2, the 401k plan, and account 3, the tax deferred IRA, the optimizer is going to get to decide whether a full or partial rollover for this investor is desirable or not desirable. Kind of moving on to account 4, which again, I think this is interesting, is, in this case, the investor has 2 different lots of employer stock. I'll point out that lot 2 here, notice that its current value is well above, the cost. So to the degree that lot 2 is sold, it'll end up causing much higher kind of realized taxes for the investor. And then something that one would expect is that in this particular investment, the person it has a current value of $75,000. It's a high cost, I've labeled it that way, bond fund, but it's below the cost basis. So there is a tax loss that could be harvested, and one would expect this type of optimization to harvest such a loss. And then through the magic of rerunning our optimization, we get to see the answer. And so now I'll go count by count. It looks almost the same, but some of my columns are now different. And you get to see in account or column 2, that was kind of where we started. Then we've labeled it time 0. After the optimization, what is the optimizer? What is this system recommending is bought or sold? And what we see here is that they're selling out of this passive ETF and going with the higher alpha global equity within the tax exempt account. Moving to account 2, the tax deferred 401k, and there was no transaction costs. What we're seeing here is the rollover optimizer is in full effect. And in this case, it's suggesting that the person sell completely out of their 401k to roll that money over to the next account, account 3, the tax deferred IRA. And you can see here that the money really gets kind of consolidated in this high alpha bond fund within the tax deferred setting. And again, over here in column 6 and 7, I'll kind of point out that the $10 trade costs of a sell cost and a buy cost, these are getting, the optimizer is contemplating these costs. And of course, ideally one would set this up with whatever the actual costs would be for a given account at a given institution. And then in account 4, the taxable account, remember before the person had quite a bit of money allocated into employer stock. And you can see that the optimizer is recommending that essentially all of lot 1 of that employer stock, which came with a ton of idiosyncratic risk, is being sold off. And it's partially selling off lot 2, but not 100%. And so it's, again, there's a trade-off here where we're continuing to have a high level of idiosyncratic risk associated with holding an individual stock in this case. But we're also realizing a very large kind of taxable gain, and the optimizer doesn't like that. And then I think I highlighted down here, it does end up, harvesting, the loss. And then in terms of where does the money end up getting invested, it really ends up in this passive global ETF that you see here. And then kind of the final part of that exhibit, and we're getting close to the end of today's session, so if people have questions, please have them ready. You know, you get to see the expected alpha after, I guess, after tax alpha, kind of on a holistic basis, of the before optimization and the level of cracking error. And then on an after optimization basis or post optimization, we have a much better alpha and a much lower level of cracking error. And again, this was a very, even though it probably appeared relatively complicated, in reality, you know, people have numerous different accounts, and the number of available options that they could invest in would be much, much higher than this very simplistic example. And then, of course, many investors already hold many more items than were included in this relatively simplistic example. And so earlier I had kind of listed out 16 different questions that I think advisors and planners frequently face. And what I would point out is that, you know, by being able to look across accounts of different account types and simultaneously contemplate these decisions within the objective function, you're able to, we, you know, via this methodology are able to provide an optimal answer to all of these different potential questions. And thus this form of multi-account optimization kind of has some unexpected benefits, where it becomes not only, you know, a non-pecuniary preference optimizer, but an asset location optimizer, the rollover, reverse rollover optimizer, a smart transition management optimizer, a tax loss harvesting optimizer, an optimizer for helping you deploy or new money and or withdraw money should you need to. And that essentially concludes what I want to talk about today. Next week, we'll be wrapping it up with chapter 12, which will include kind of an end-to-end example, as well as some calls for action that Paul and I would like to make. But before I wrap up, are there any questions at this moment? No, not hearing any. I will move on, and thank you guys for joining us for today's session, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.